In considering the Trail of Tears, the Indian removals, and their impact on history, I'm going to offer some information that I hope will give you new perspective and spark some of your curiosity. First, an overview of the topic, the Trails of Tears. Then we'll dig deeper to learn more about the original people of the Western Hemisphere. And finally, we'll finish with information about current times. But I want to point out three important things that I didn't mention specifically in the presentation that I want you to take home with you. Native history is far, far greater and more important than we give it credit for being words. The descendants of the original people here are not vanished. Not the Maya, not the Aztec, not the Mohican, the Miami, or the Potawatomi. They are not gone. This is called lasting. Last of the Miami, last of the Mohicans. It's false. They live right here, still, gaining strength, reclaiming their ancient knowledge, and finding ways to practice their culture despite all that has happened. So keep those in mind as we look back over some early history of the United States. Researching this topic was like looking at both sides, let's see if I get this right, both sides of the same coin. Standard American history tells the heads version. Stories of wise founders, battles, manifest destiny. But the coin is thin without the other side, the side with the eagle clutching the arrows. The removals were pivotal, not only for virtually all Native people, but for the United States as a new nation. To quote the Smithsonian's Lonnie Bunch, you can tell a lot about a country by what it chooses to remember. You can tell even more by what a nation chooses to forget. The Trail of Tears period is considered one of the darkest chapters in American history. The events continue to be an important part of the historical and cultural memory of the indigenous peoples, leaving a lasting legacy of loss, trauma, and displacement. Trail of Tears refers to a series of relocations at gunpoint of various Native American nations from their ancestral homelands to Indian territories in present-day Oklahoma. Often associated with the forced relocation of the Cherokee Nation, events were primarily from 1860 to 1878 and directly affected approximately 70 nations, including the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, Shawnee, Osage, and Miami. The Potawatomi called their removal exodus the Trail of Death. Removals were a result of 40 years of action by the federal government to seize land, culminating in the Indian Removal Act. It was signed into law in 1830 by President Andrew Jackson. The act authorized the federal government to negotiate with Native American tribes for their removal to the territory west of the Mississippi River. Jackson had come to believe that forcing indigenous people out was essential to national security. He had no qualms about violating existing treaties or court decisions. Federal agents implemented the act despite the U.S. Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall having decided it was unconstitutional. The Native nations repeatedly affirmed in their verbal and written negotiations with federal agents, commissioners, congressmen, and presidents that they did not want to leave their land and wished to find ways to stay despite the encroachments of Americans. The decades-long military campaign used an estimated 40% of the new nation's GDP in the course of making possible the development of an explicitly white man's country. One of the first acts of the new United States was the first Congress's 1790 Naturalization Act. I think we've heard a little about that lately with the recent Supreme Court decision. This act limited citizenship to, quote, free white persons of good character. Intertwined with the story of African slavery, this saga is why some scholars and politicians contend that racism is America's original sin. Backed by the new government's military power, mass evictions displaced from 60,000 to 100,000 people, putting more than 100 million acres, 100 million acres of their ancestral homelands into the hands of settlers and speculators. The evictions caused the loss of an estimated 10,000 lives during and immediately afterward. Most deaths were due to exposure, starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Some elders and children were simply not strong enough for the journey of hundreds, even 1,000 miles, on foot, horseback, canal boat, even seagoing ships. Many of the travels occurred in the winter to western lands that were called wastelands by the government men assigning the new reservations. Removal. It's a bland word, sense of housekeeping, so it's sort of vaguely surgical. Let's listen to what removal was like from the Native American viewpoint, a view most of us have not heard. First, an account from a Choctaw diary describing the first groups traveling in the late fall of 1831. Nearly 4,000 Choctaw left Mississippi in that first wave. As they prepared for their journey, sheriffs and constables descended on them with fraudulent writs of confiscation for their goods. Choctaw Chief Greenwood LaFleur's nephew, a product of missionary schools and loyal to his people, kept a record of the march. We have had very bad weather. Since we landed at this place, about 20 of us have died and still are continuing to die. We are about 200 miles from the Red River. It will be sometime in February before we get where we want to settle. We are compelled to travel slow as there are so many sick people. I'm afraid that a great many will die before we get there. A white man, Joseph Kerr, watched the procession as it passed. They were two large, deep streams that must be crossed in a boat or by raft, and one other nearly impassable either way. This was to be done in the worst weather I have ever seen in this country, heavy sleet having broken and bowed all the small and much of the large timber. And this was to be performed under the pressure of hunger by old women and young children, without any covering for their feet, legs, or body except a cotton underdress. I gave the party leave to enter a small field in which pumpkins were. They would not enter without leave, even though starving. These they ate with great avidity. And the area he's talking about is right here at the Red River. So they had already come from, quite the length of some of their, what are now states. As the long lines of people inched through the series of storms and floods, another killer joined the procession, cholera. In all, an estimated 2,500 of the 4,000 Choctaw who set forth died along the route. For an even larger number of Cherokee and the Southeast's 5 civilized nations, the journey was similarly deadly. By 1838, of the estimated 17,000 Cherokee, only about 2,000 had left their Georgia homeland for the Indian Territory. President Martin Van Buren sent General Winfield Scott and 7,000 soldiers to speed the process. Scott and his troops forced the Cherokee into stockades at bayonet point, while his men looted their homes and belongings. Then they marched the Indians more than 1,200 miles to Indian Territory. Historians estimate that more than 5,000 Cherokee died as a result of the journey. The Potawatomi journey also began in 1838. Here's an account from the tribal website. In early September 1838, General Tipton called for a council of Potawatomi leaders at the Menominees village near Twin Lakes in Indiana to discuss the issue of removal. In reality, the general had no intention of talking about removal. The Potawatomi were leaving Indiana whether they wanted to or not. On the morning of September 4th, A group of 859 Potawatomi, with their leaders shackled and restrained in the back of a wagon, set out on a forced march from their homeland in northern Indiana for a small reserve in present-day Kansas. To minimize the temptation for the Potawatomi to try and escape and return home, the militia members burned both fields and houses as the dejected members of the wagon train departed. The journey was a 660-mile trek for which the Potawatomi were not prepared, and through terrain to which they were not accustomed. They only had a few hundred horses to carry people and supplies, and the promised additional wagons never arrived, so even the weak and elderly were forced to walk. The pace and conditions of the march debilitated the health of travelers, and a day rarely passed that a member of the party did not die, usually a child, forcing their bereft and exhausted families to leave the bodies behind in hastily dug graves. In the end, more than 40 people died. Having observed other people's treatment, the Miami were able to delay many years, including a 5-year delay in order to settle their debts. As the time moved closer, some Miami fled, and others were exempted by earlier treaties. Tribal historian Diane Hunter recorded this recollection as part of the tribe's massive research prior to the 175th observance of this event. And I'm going to see if I can play her telling the story herself. So, give me a second here. We've all seen.
On October 6, 1846, they boarded us onto canal boats on the Wabash and Erie Canal, and they took us east into Ohio, and then we transferred to the Miami and Erie Canal. On the canals, we were going past our homes, our villages, our own private reserves, going past places that have been our home, places of importance to us, and we knew we would never see those.
So, John Dawson, Fort Wayne newspaperman and later Utah territorial governor, was present the day in 1846 for the removal through Fort Wayne and wrote, "Well, I remember the saddened faces, the profusion of tears, as I saw them hug to their bosoms little handfuls of earth which they had gathered from the graves of their dead kindred. But stern fate made them succumb, and as the canal boat bore them to the Ohio River, the canal boat that would bear them to the Ohio River, many a bystander was moved to tears at the evidence of grief he saw before him." So, how did we get to that point? Yeah. And here's the map of how they went from Peru on the canal up to Fort Wayne to Defiance, then down to Cincinnati, where they boarded a steamship for the long trip. Okay, I just forwarded a picture here, but there. To a place in Kansas also, near the Potawatomi. Now, and yes, Seven Pillars was one of the places that they today still hold, the Mississinawa River. And then the crane, that's their tribal emblem, and the chevron design was on that last slide. So how did we get to that point? It was centuries in the making. We all know the Eurocentric version with its messages of they were in the way, and the land was too good not to farm. It goes something like this. Let's see if I can get it. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Explorers landed on empty beaches. The bands of people they encountered were strange, primitive nomads. They wore skins and feathers, wove blankets, and used stone-tipped arrows, not much different from what they used when they wandered across the Bering Straits. When the settlers came, the Indians fought back savagely. So for the pioneers' safety, they had to go. For those who moved in, the story of the disappearance of the Indian became a tale that absolved settlers of any guilt. Now, they're all gone, except for in commercials about the environment, portrayed by a Sicilian actor. But the true story is so much more amazing. When Europeans stumbled on the lands of the Western Hemisphere, they found ancient cultures in the South where sophisticated empires formed over the course of tens of thousands of years. In the northern woodlands, there were hundreds of nations, between 700 and 1,000 by some estimates. And this is the best map I could find that gave a pretty comprehensive list of all the different Indian nations. For DNA origins have traced, particularly the South American communities, to areas of now submerged lands in East Indonesia. The hemisphere supported estimates of up to 15 to 20 million people, generally peaceful, living in well-established communities with complex social structures, thriving trade routes, manufacturing facilities, and centers of learning. Virtually every part of North, Central, and South America and the islands of the Gulf hosted native populations. Inca, Aztec, Pueblo, Natchez, and Caddo civilizations built cities, mined and smelted astonishing amounts of gold, silver, copper, and lead, and they domesticated crops, corn, potatoes, squash, beans, berries, peppers, tomatoes, chocolate, tobacco, and shaped forms of worship and healing at the same time as other major civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. They built homes in a wide range of climate-appropriate building styles, laid irrigation systems in the desert, managed forests and open lands for maximum productivity, and stewarded huge herds of buffalo and llamas. LiDAR scans of the jungles of Central America and the Amazon basin, and of farm fields in Wisconsin, show evidence of buildings, wide straight roads, and fertile farming systems capable of supporting huge populations. These glory days came to a sudden halt in the late 1400s. Conquistadors, explorers, and colonists brought diseases. The epidemics of measles, influenza, smallpox, tuberculosis, typhus, whooping cough, and more may have been the most devastating in all of human history. Far ahead of any white man, the diseases raced north from the Spanish colonies and west from the Atlantic coast. Where once there were communities of 20 to 30,000 individuals, European colonists and settlers would find bands of determined survivors. The history of the clash of cultures added to the tragedy over the next several hundred years. The native people did not know that, to the newcomers, they were ignorant savages. They understood themselves to be sovereign nations, fully versed in the ways of a world they had been shaping for millennia. The uncivilized ones were the new arrivals. The Miami, who now recaptured their traditional name and call themselves Miamia, called the newcomers squatters, or Mishimalsa. Up in the Cape Cod area, for example, Puritans' practices of letting their cows and pigs roam while fencing in their crops made no sense to Pequot women, who could lose a whole field of maize to colonial hogs. The first war recorded in North America grew out of numerous such annoyances. Called the Pequot War, it set a pattern that repeated nearly constantly over the next 200 years. And the handout you'll be getting includes a page-long list of all the different wars that happened between 1600 and 1814. Time again, natives would seek alliances, playing the English, French, Dutch, and Spanish off against each other. Along with dealing with Europeans, the leaders would also factor in their own strategic moves, steps to replenish disease-ravaged communities, to gain strength over rival nations, to seek to monopolize trade for new necessities like guns, pots, needles, and wampum beads. Europe's clash of empires in the late 1700s had huge ripples through North America. Here's America. This resulted in what historians of the period have begun to call the 60 Years' War, from 1754 to 1814. British alliances with native nations were part of the ongoing dispute, as mentioned in the Declaration of Independence itself. Turmoil in the Upper Ohio continued after America defeated the British. In 1795, the Treaty of Greenville claimed much of what became Ohio. It set a precedent by recognizing tribes as sovereign native nations, so included requiring the ceding of land, and it included annuity payments to the natives of cash and calico cloth. Over the next 100 years, the U.S. government would make and break an estimated 374 treaties with Indian nations. Native nations, exhausted by centuries of battle and disease, saw clearly that the invaders would not ever be deterred from their land hunger. In the late 1820s, another hunger entered the picture: gold. The find was on Cherokee land in northern Georgia, and this sped the passage of the Indian Removal Act, with the main target of the law being the large, settled and perceived as rich Cherokee nation. Officials at the time also realized that it could provide a way to force out the Great Lakes tribes, particularly Potawatomi, Ottawa, Miami, and the other tribes of the Great Indian Federation that had fought so strongly under Little Turtle and Tecumseh. So the stage was set for what the natives called the long, unjust journey. People were herded to places they had never been, homeless, penniless, ill, and helpless, without their long-established knowledge of healing plants, edible foods, watercourses, weather patterns, neighbors, and the comforting presence of the graves of their ancestors. As for the Miami people, in 1873, depleted by the continuing traumas of dislocation, a group of Miami left Kansas for a much smaller part of Oklahoma. In 1890, my grandmother was 2 years old. The town of Miami, Oklahoma, was formed by the purchase of 58 acres from the Ottawa tribe, and the town now numbers 13,500 people, is the county seat of Ottawa County, and home to the federally recognized national tribe. Harassment and officially sanctioned abuses of Indians continued for another 100 years through the reservation system, boarding schools dedicated to cultural destruction. You've heard of the take the Indian out of the man idea. White's Institute in Wabash County was one of those boarding schools. And most recently, and this blew my mind, resettlement by the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the 1960s and 70s, from reservations to cities like San Francisco, Chicago, and New York, on the promise of good jobs if they would leave the reservation. At some of the powwows, there were Indians with very amazing Brooklyn accents. So the current situation. We've been downplaying this part of our mutual history, and the costs have been high. Of that there is no doubt. The ironic truth is that we could also learn much from our American Indian neighbors about how to persist, how to deal with people we do not understand, how to survive and rise again. While death and chaos have attacked their communities, they found ways to adapt, to focus on what is most important to them. As Kevin Gover of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian has said, "The only thing I'm confident about is that Indians will never give up, and they will never stop being Indians." To quote Principal Chief Douglas Langford of the Biamia tribe, in a ceremony in Oxford, Ohio in 2021, observing the 175th year since removal. Please know that this event touches our hearts in ways I cannot speak of without being overcome by emotion. Removal negatively affected every aspect of our identity, our sovereignty, our culture, our land, our language, and community traditions. But together, we have emerged from that darkness, surviving to this new day of restored knowledge, vitality, governmental strength, and self-determination. Today, tribes provide $4.6 billion in wages to the economy of Oklahoma. Various nations deploy teams of legal experts to revisit old treaties seeking to overcome losses that put Native people at a disadvantage in health and living standards. And the National Park Service has a cross-country network of trails where descendant groups gather to walk the actual routes of several of the nation's journeys. That always kind of gets me. In 1994, as part of the Fort Wayne Bicentennial, Chief Floyd Leonard came to Fort Wayne to meet with elders and carry the message that tribal elders in both Oklahoma and here were concerned about the prospect of their language dying out. Discussion resulted in a strong determination, there we go, to revive the unique and beautiful Biamia language, and with it cultural elements including song, design, and food. A change in 1996 in the tribe's national constitution allowed documented Indian descendants to reunite under the Oklahoma federally recognized status. Some also chose to remain involved with the nonprofit Miami Nation of Indiana. The Oklahoma tribe joined forces with Miami University in Ohio to create the Biamia Center. Today, scholars and elders pooled knowledge and have started camps for children, and they're creating a new generation of speakers comfortable in the ancient tongue. From that time on, the descendants, interestingly, some of whom were the 7th generation from the people who fought with Little Turtle, now include hundreds of young citizens comfortable in speaking Miamiatawi, which is their word for their language. So that is my presentation. Thank you for listening to me, and as my Miamiaki friends would say, Newe.